I'm Rick Howard, and this is Santa Monica, California, my home. I was born and raised around here, and I love the sport of surfing. My friends and I used to surf every chance we got. One good friend of mine in particular, named Clark Merritt, and I once started a trip around the world to make a surfing film. Clark had found a financial backer who believed in this dream, and before we knew it, we had 2 completely paid-for round-the-world tickets. We didn't get very far, though. We only got to the first couple destinations on our trip, and our financial backer backed out, cut us off with no money. Well, Clark cashed the rest of his ticket in and flew home. He said that he had a couple of other ideas that he wanted to try, but I just couldn't do that. I'd never had a round-the-world ticket before, so I decided to see as much as I could before running out of money myself. But by the time I got to the Philippines, I only had enough money left for about 2 weeks. But 2 weeks is not what happened. What did happen, I'm going to show you now. So please enjoy the real world of the Philippines.
Nilayasan, iniwanan at ibang pinuntahan. Parang babaeng ang hirap talagang malimutan. Ikaw lamang ang aking laging
The Philippines is right in the center of Southeast Asia. It's south of China, north of Indonesia, and east of Vietnam. The capital city, Manila, is on Luzon, a large island in the north.
Manila, I keep coming back to Manila. Simply ain't no place like Manila. Manila, I'm coming home. I walk the streets of San Francisco. I've tried the rides in Disneyland. Dated a million girls in Sydney.
When I first arrived, I caught a taxi from the airport to a hotel that a friend of mine back in Bali had recommended. He neglected to mention, though, that the hotel was on the other side of town from the airport, so I got my first tour of Manila in this cab. Driving across the city, I noticed how modern Manila really is. This was a little bit of a surprise to me. I'd heard so many stories about the destruction here after the Second World War that the big tall buildings were a bit of a shock. Makati, an area in downtown Manila, the most modern part of the city. Many of the buildings look like buildings you might find in any Western city in the world. Many of these buildings were designed by Western architects, but they weren't built the same way. There's a few very unique differences in many of the building techniques. One of them is that many of the Chinese builders here believe that there's a spirit in bamboo, so they won't touch metal scaffolding. They feel that if they use this wooden scaffolding, and anybody falls, there will always be a piece to reach out and grab, thanks partially to that spirit. So no matter how tall the buildings are, they look like this when they're going up. You can be in a modern part of the city like Makati, drive across town and find yourself in a bit of the old Asia that people think of. It really just depends on which part of the city you're driving through.
50 mani. Lambong mani. Lambong mani. Salapi mani. 50 mani. Lambong mani. Lambong mani.
One of the first things that I noticed were these interesting little passenger vehicles everywhere. They're called jeepneys, and I found out later that most of Manila would be paralyzed without them. It seems that after the Second World War, there were quite a few American jeeps left over. Well, an enterprising Filipino got the idea of converting them into these little buses. You can climb on anywhere in the street, and for about 7 cents, you can go as far as the jeepney route will take you. They have a factory that turns out brand new jeepneys every day now. But I think a few of the old ones from the Second World War are still around. They drive jeepneys until they fall apart. Here's one of the old ones now. They say that no 2 jeepneys look alike. Well, for a little bit less than 7 cents, there's a more rustic way of getting around if you're not in a hurry. And for a little bit more, there's the air-conditioned Love Bus. And about 1 million taxis. Finding a ride in Manila is no problem. I think the second thing I noticed here were the crazy traffic conditions, the way the people drive. You see, there aren't any lines painted on the road, so nobody pays any attention to anything like lanes. But they always barely seem to get you where you're going. In any big city during rush hour, you're always going to find yourself in a traffic jam. But that's no problem here. I found that the Filipino cab drivers in Manila spoke the international language better than anybody else I'd ever met. An extra 20 will get you there in one big hurry. Dengue fever. I had contracted a disease called dengue fever from the mosquito bites back on Bali. For a week I felt like I was going to die. My new neighbors next door tried to nurse me back to health. Yeah, their methods left a little bit to be desired, but their heart was in the right place. It's frightening getting sick alone in a foreign country. These people next door didn't even know me, but they took very good care of me that week. When I recovered, I decided to stick around at least long enough to get to know this nice family better. Went outside that first morning after recovering and met all the kids in my neighborhood. Found out my name was Joe. Hi, Joe. If you're an American, you hear that a lot in this country. It's a name that stuck with us after the Second World War.
The Filipinos are very warm and affectionate people. It's not unusual at all in this country to see two men or two women walking down the street holding hands or with their arms around each other. It's a common expression of friendship in this country.
Philippines is primarily a Catholic country. That's due to about 350 years of Spanish heritage. Most of the kids go to Catholic school, and all their money is in pesos and centavos.
But the Islamic world also shares this land and has for over 600 years. Well, since the end of the Second World War, the Filipinos have governed themselves, and they've developed a very colorful lifestyle, which is sort of a combination of all these different cultures mixed together here.
And then there's the ladies. In my opinion, the Filipinos are about the most beautiful ladies in Asia. They're a combination of Westerners from all over the world who came together with people from this part of the world hundreds of years ago to create the Filipinos.
I'm the young boy in the midnight Chile wind, rambling, feeling at a photograph, painting deep in him. He knows he must be the greatest love he'll know.
A couple of days after I recovered from dengue fever, I asked this girl living down the hall from me if there was anything in or around Manila that I should see before leaving. She said yes. We hopped on a bus, and a couple of hours later we were on the banks of a beautiful river. I had hired a boat and 2 boatmen for 40 pesos. That was about $7. We were paddling upstream to a waterfall called Paksanghan. These people are harvesting copra, a product derived from the coconuts. That's one of the ways to make a living on this river. Actually, there are many ways to make a living on this particular river. You can be a boatman if you know the river well enough. If you don't want to work that hard, you can always try to sell cold beer out of your ice chest to the tourists.
Weeks and months and years ago, and a businessman they say, oh boy, you gotta keep on changing. There ain't no way. Here come a field modern time. Here come a field.
The lower part of the river is very placid and calm. But the farther upstream you get, the harder these guys have to work for their 40 pesos. Remember, they're pushing us upstream here against the flow of water. He's pushing in the front of the boat, and his partner's working just as hard in the back. A couple of times they pushed us up spots where the water was only about 6 inches deep.
You can hear the rocks scraping the bottom. One time I tried to get out and help, and he said, no, you're the guest, relax, we'll do all the work. And then another time, he and his partner actually picked that boat up, like a stretcher with both of us still sitting in it, and carried it over a few rocks. A couple of spots were so rough, we couldn't imagine how they could get us any farther upstream. And then before we knew it, we were there. It was a beautiful waterfall with a cave behind it. By using one of these rafts, you can go under the falls and explore the cave behind. It's a bit of a tight squeeze getting between the rocks and the waterfall there, but once you get inside, it's a dry cave. You can walk around in it. Well, here's the part that the boatmen like the best. The hard work's all over. It takes them about 2 hours to get you up here and about a half hour to get you back down. They lower you down over the upstream rough spots with these bamboo poles that are stretched from rock to rock. They slide you across the top of them. Then when they hit the open water, the guy in the front does the steering with his paddle. He threads you between these rocks like a big needle. During the high water time of year, it's a fast trip to the bottom. Manila Bay. Manila Bay is one of those places in the world that's known for its sunsets. When the sun sets here, it paints the whole sky red on its way down. I've time-lapsed a few of them here so you can not only see all of these sunsets, you can also see what the world looks like when it's moving 100 times faster than normal. Romantic place, Manila Bay. There's two places in the Philippines I found what I would consider to be a good nightlife. There's Manila, of course, and the other city is Olongapo at Subic Bay, the U.S. Navy base here. There's been a very close tie between the Americans and Filipinos for many years, due primarily through our Peace Corps, our missionaries, and our military here. So it's hard to find a Filipino who can't speak at least some English. Makes it very nice for the American tourists. There are so many interesting things to see and do that I just couldn't see leaving for home yet, even though I was almost out of money. For example, what would any Southeast Asian country be without its own form of the martial arts? In the Philippines, they call it arnis de mano. These guys would work out in Rizal Park across the street from my hotel every morning. Friendly group of guys, a couple of them showed me around Manila after I recovered from dengue fever. You wouldn't want to fight with one of them, though. It'd be like walking into the prop of an airplane. And on Sunday, as I was walking around, I found roosters tied up all over the place. I found that cockfighting is extremely popular all over this country. Two men staged a little street fight for me. They told me that their birds couldn't really hurt each other in these street fights because this is how they train their birds to fight in the arena on Sunday, so they removed their foot spur, which is their only weapon. I call my films the real world for a purpose. This is the real world of the Philippines. I also have the real world of Thailand, Bali, Indonesia, Tahiti, Hawaii, and so on. The reason I've chosen this title is that rather than to show you a candy-coated type of tourism promotion look at a country, I prefer to at least give you an opportunity to see what these countries are really like. Cockfighting is the only legal form of gambling in the Philippines. It's treated the same way here as horse racing would be in America, or bullfighting in Spain or Mexico. It's amazing that something so illegal all over the West is so legal and popular all over the East. In every town or village, no matter how small, there will be an arena. And on Sunday, a large part of the population can be found here. The most amazing thing about these fights to me are the way that the bets were made. There's so much noise in the arena with everybody yelling that no one can hear anyone else, so there are hand signals that mean different amounts of money to be bet. Now the amazing thing is that there might be hundreds, sometimes thousands of people in the gallery, but there will only be 2 bet takers in the ring. Somehow, without writing anything down, these 2 guys can remember every bet on sight in a crowd like that, just by hand signals. They write nothing, but at the end of each fight they know who won, who lost, and exactly how much. Just before the fight starts, a very sharp steel spur is attached to one ankle of each bird in the place where the natural one is. When these fights start, you can usually hear the arena for almost a mile. Well, that's it. As I said, they're much shorter than a bullfight, which can go on for a good part of the afternoon. Then on the way home from the cockfight in the jeepney, I saw something that I had never expected to find in the Philippines: surfboards on a taxi. I told the jeepney driver to follow that cab. He was explaining that jeepneys couldn't follow taxis in Manila when the cab stopped in front of a hotel, so I got off to see who it was. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was my friend Clark. He had done exactly what he said he was going to do. He went back home, found himself another job. Now he was back in Asia again looking for surf, and I ran into him in Manila. It really is a small world. It seems that Clark had been hired by one of his old employers, Surf Magazine. Within the next few years, there is going to be an international surfing contest starting. The best surfers in the world would be traveling around the world together and competing on the best waves. But first, the best waves had to be found. That's what they had hired Clark to look for. He hadn't had much luck, though. He had been here for almost a month, spent most of his money, and hadn't found any good surf yet. But he did have 2 surfboards, so I decided to help him search. First, we went to the Philippine Department of Tourism. They said they didn't really think they had any good surf here, but we could find some and photograph it. They might be able to work out some type of job for us. Well, that was all we needed to hear. The next day, we'd be searching for surf. That day, walking around Manila, I noticed again how beautiful and modern this city was, but I wouldn't really be telling the whole story of Manila without showing you the other side of this city's face. These people are living on the tidal wave wall that surrounds Manila Bay. The tragedy is that they were evicted from their shanty town last week. A big fire burned out hundreds of families. The second part of that tragedy is that next week they will be evicted from here because the first typhoon of the season will strike. Naturally, anybody living this close to the water will have to move. That's the main problem all over Southeast Asia. So few with so much, and so many with nothing. Well, the next day we were on a bus, bouncing our way across about 100 miles of dirt road, heading for a little fishing village called Baler. Like Manila, Baler is on Luzon, the large island in the north, a little hook of land there. And Luzon is in the typhoon belt. This is the path the seasonal typhoons take every year as they rip their way across Southeast Asia. Well, the first one of the season was on its way. We found out that that typhoon was the only chance we had to find good surf. We hadn't come here during the right time of year. The waves get big naturally during the winter, but we were here in the summer. But they told us that on the day before a typhoon, the waves get big before the typhoon really strikes. We might be able to surf for a while before the storm really hit. Otherwise, we'd have both been back home pretty soon because we were almost out of money by now. We were heading to an area occupied by a revolutionary group called the NPA, the New People's Army. So they sent a military escort out here to guard us. We found out later, though, that we would have been better off without this guy. The NPA had nothing against American surfers, they just didn't like the Philippine Army. Baler. We climbed off the bus to find out that all the kids here already knew our names. Joe. It seemed that was about the only English they knew, though. Apparently we had ventured far enough away from Manila that not too many Westerners had come out here. Our language hadn't really rubbed off yet. We had to use our surfer magazines to get the point across as to what we were looking for and why. They thought we were crazy. Very curious, though, especially about the surfboards. We soon found out that the words malaking alun meant big waves, but these people couldn't understand why we wanted big waves. Even though they get big waves every year, they cause a lot of trouble for these people. Many of them are fishermen. Baler is primarily a fishing village. Every morning these guys will untangle and repair their nets. Then they will paddle them out in their bankas. A Philippine outrigger canoe is called a banka. And this is why the big waves can be a big problem for them. They have to paddle out through them every morning to deploy their nets. They'll get their nets out, paddle back, and start pulling them in. They've been doing this so long together, it looks very much like a dance. When the fish get closer to shore, the whole family comes out to get into the act. They all seem to be having a lot of fun while they made a living at the same time. Mostly they caught these little bite-sized fish. They'll dry them out in the sun, which preserves them for a long time with no refrigeration. Many very unique eating habits out in the province. They cook pig in an interesting way. It's called lechon. Believe me, it's a lot better than it looks. It's delicious. We soon realized that it would have been a shame to have left this country without ever venturing out of the capital city. Once we left Manila, we saw how beautiful the Philippines really was. There's a friend of ours named Ray. He's carrying a gun because he's a policeman here. Ray wanted to learn how to surf, so we told him we'd teach him. There's a man walking his pig. As you can see, Baler is a very primitive place. There's no pavement on any of the roads, no plumbing or electricity. Most of the people live in a nipa hut. Nipa is the word used for palm, so a nipa hut is a hut that's made out of palm fronds. There were only a couple of concrete buildings in the whole village. One of them was a hotel. But we soon found out that we wouldn't have even needed the one hotel they had here. These people were so friendly that the first day we arrived, 3 families offered to take us in for as long as we wanted to stay, just because we were strangers in their village and therefore guests. We spent most of the morning photographing the village while they were preparing for the typhoon. Typhoon Meiling was supposed to strike at about noon tomorrow. These typhoons cause a lot of damage every year here, so the people really have to prepare, tie everything down. Then we asked a man if he knew where we could find waves like the pictures that he had seen in our surfer magazines. He said yes, that we'd have to take a trip through the jungle on a tricycle and spend the night out on the beach in a nipa hut. But early tomorrow morning, before the typhoon really struck, the waves might get big enough for our purposes. So we hired a tricycle, tied our surfboards on top, and took off down this jungle trail for our overnight hut on the beach. They call these tricycles. They're really little Japanese motorcycles with sidecars on them. Taxi cab of the provinces. They can take you almost anywhere. Well, the waves were very small that morning, so we took this opportunity to teach Ray how to surf. Park took him out, shoved him into a couple of waves. Here's his first ride. Ride number 2. His third try was really very good for somebody who's never tried this before. He's up. Good third try. Well, all that night we could feel the approaching typhoon in the air. It was an interesting feeling, a hot wind that started at around midnight. As the morning wore on, the wind got stronger and stronger. By the time the sun came up, there was a pretty brisk little breeze whipping around the walls of our nipa hut. The kids all knew why we had come, and they were as excited as we were, trying to get us out of bed with the sunrise. Well, I climbed out of bed that morning with about 50 more mosquito bites than I had gone to bed with. But a few minutes later, it all seemed worth it, because the surf was beautiful. After I got this first ride, I could hear the kids yelling and screaming from the beach. Clark couldn't believe his luck. A surfer looking for waves for a contest, as he was doing, wouldn't have wanted the very large waves that you might find in Hawaii in the winter. If we found him here, they'd be too dangerous for a new contest, not knowing what the strange coral reef on the bottom was like. What he needed and what we found were fairly good-sized waves that were perfectly shaped for surfing. That means they have to break from one side to the other like these. Notice as long as I stay ahead of the whitewater here, I get a ride. If the whitewater catches up to me, the ride's over. Clark going left, as long as he stays on that blue wall of water ahead of him, he can maneuver his board up and down, side to side, and do all of the things that get a surfer points in a contest. Not only did he have the waves he needed now for his contest, we also had the pictures we needed to prove to the Department of Tourism here that they did have what it took for this sport. We didn't have a job yet, but we were one important step closer. At least now we had a chance. We came in for lunch at about noon, and the tide pulled out a little bit, exposing very sharp coral heads which prevented us from paddling back out. But that was all right, because in about 10 more seconds, this scene had turned into this. I had no idea how quickly a typhoon could strike. Literally in a few minutes, the wind went from 10 or 15 miles an hour up to around 50 or 60. We had to crawl back through the jungle to our hotel, and for the next day and a half, Typhoon Meling tore this little fishing village to pieces. It's a good thing our hotel was concrete. The center winds that night were 130 miles an hour. This big jungle moth flew into our room to get out of the storm. He spent the night there with us. The next day after the storm ended, he just flew away, but while he was with us, he became very tame. Big moth, a lot bigger than my hand. Typhoon Meling had a diameter of more than 200 miles, so it hit Belair and Manila at about the same time. But these people can't afford to stop just because of the big storm. They go through this quite a few times a year, so they just go about their business the best they can under the circumstances. Quite a few electrical fires during some of these storms also. They're not caused by lightning, though. They're caused by the faulty old wiring combined with the high winds. The winds blow, the wires break, and the buildings burn. All that night, the typhoon raged on. And by early the next morning, the skies were beginning to clear.
But Typhoon Meling had left her mark on the streets of Manila.
Here's an example of that wiring problem I told you about. Very sturdy repair job here. Then there's the flooding. Down by Manila Bay, the streets look like this for a day or so after the larger storms, while the water runs off into the bay. This kind of flood would probably paralyze most of the cities in the world. But here they barely seem to even notice that their capital was underwater. I think I saw as much traffic on the street this day as I had seen before the storm. Back in Belair, yesterday morning this beach had been completely covered with nipa huts. Now only uprooted palm trees are left. But the people are all still here with their belongings, cooking breakfast as if nothing had happened. They said that after they ate breakfast, they would rebuild the hut. Further inland, the huts didn't blow down, they just bent over in the wind. This whole family safely rode out the storm in their nipa hut, and just like a palm tree, rather than to break in the wind, it bent. All of the big bugs come out after the storm, too. I found this guy outside the next morning and put him in the soap dish for Clark when he went in for his shower. On the way back to Manila, we came to what had been a little stream on the way out. Now it had turned into a wide river. We started across, got about halfway, and the bus started sliding sideways downstream. Clark and I almost climbed out the window. The driver looked back and said, "Relax, we'll make it." Just then we did make it. Everybody laughed. The driver shook his head, said crazy Americans try to climb out of the bus in the middle of a river. All the way back to Manila, we could see a lot of damage from the storm. And once we did get back, we saw that those people had been evicted from that tidal wave wall. They won't be back for 3 or 4 months at least until the typhoon season ends. We took our pictures to the Department of Tourism, and they were very impressed to find out that they did have good surfing waves here. They told us that they probably would hire us, but it would take a week or so in red tape. They had to get approval from the people higher up, things like that. We said that sounds very exciting, but for one problem, we're out of money. How do we stay here for another week? Then they told us to go downstairs and to talk to the 2 tourism reception ladies who worked in the main office. These 2 ladies knew most of the hotel owners in town, and they could probably get us into a place for a free week, just on the chance that we might get that job and then give that hotel some free publicity. Notice the security guard here in the blue uniform.
These guys were guarding most of the public buildings with some of the ugliest looking homemade weapons I had ever seen. This is the middle of the Marcos regime. Martial law is in effect, a 1 o'clock curfew every night. Very dangerous place to be.
Back before martial law had been declared, many parts of the Philippines were like the Roaring Twenties in Chicago, gangland rule. Well, when they declared martial law, they confiscated most of the gang's weapons, but instead of disposing of them as they would have done in this country, they passed them out to the security guards. So now your hotels and banks are being guarded by these homemade hand cannons.
Well, after the week was over, so was our free hotel stay, and we still didn't have a job. But we did get very lucky in my favorite little restaurant, Andy Cap's Inn. The owner-manager there, a good friend of mine named Easy Black, told us that he knew how we could make 100 pesos a day. That was about $17. Not a lot of money, but enough to stay in an inexpensive pension house while we waited for the job that we really wanted. Easy Black is the owner here, and there he is in his favorite position. His waitresses would never let us wake him up until his nap was over at 5 o'clock. Well, Easy Black is right out of a Humphrey Bogart movie. He's an American who spent enough time here to really learn his way around. He told us that the First Lady of this country was presently making a series of films about the history of the Philippines, from pre-Spanish time all the way to the present. They needed actors for 100 pesos a day. So here we are. We're in the cavalry here, 1890s. Right after the Spanish-American War, there was a little war between the Americans and the Filipinos. That's the scene that we were shooting on this day. On another day, we had been Spanish conquistadors here with Magellan 350 years ago. And on still another day, we were fighting World War II as American GIs. Here I am on my steed. What they really needed us for was to die. They only had about 35 American actors, and they had to kill hundreds of us in these films. So they kept dressing us up differently and killing us from different camera angles, so we would look like different people dying. We all died many times for our country that month.
This job was not only a lot of fun, but there isn't too much that we didn't learn about the last 350 years of Philippine history. Well, this cavalry scene was the last scene in the movie, so this was our last day of shooting. That meant our income was going to end today. We finally faced the fact that the job with the Department of Tourism was never really going to happen, so we booked a flight home for early the next morning. Then we called our friends at the Department of Tourism and thanked them for encouraging us to stay around. Even though they really hadn't been able to hire us, they had caused us to stay for a whole month, and we'd had a wonderful time. We said that we would come back someday maybe and finish the job. Then we went out for one last night on the town.
Manila is one of those international cities that you hear about. Whatever you're looking for here as far as cuisine, entertainment, you can find it in Manila. You can be in one part of town watching classic old Philippine folk dances, such as seen here. Walk across the street and find yourself in a club where they're playing rock and roll. We ended up that night in the Salahis Hotel in the Stargazer Lounge on top. But we got home fairly early that night because we didn't want to miss our flight the next morning. By 11 o'clock we were in our pension house. By midnight we were asleep. Then just before 1 o'clock there was a knock on our door. A couple of our friends from the Department of Tourism were there. They moved us in the middle of the night to a different hotel. It wasn't until the next morning we woke up to find out that we weren't in a hotel at all. We were in a penthouse on top of one of the tallest buildings in Manila. We had our own private swimming pool, servants everywhere. I got on the telephone and called the Department of Tourism and said, what happened? They said, well, last night, in the middle of the night, we hired you. Just yesterday, it seemed as though we had hit the bottom of the barrel. Today, it seemed like the whole country had been dropped in our laps. Time to go over the map again, but this time we didn't have to do it alone. Our new guide, Leo, popped into our lives. Leo told the people at the Department of Tourism that he knew how to surf. That's what got him this job with us. When he got us alone, he told us he really didn't know how to surf. He just wanted to get out of the office for a while. We told him we'd teach him. The first place they sent us was this very unique hotel.
These domes provide lighting to the underground hotel here. Each room is underground with a big picture window that looks out over an extinct volcano crater with a lake in it. Taal, one of the most beautiful sights in this country. Well, the Philippine Department of Tourism had hired us to film surfing, scuba diving, hang gliding, and water skiing for their own promotions. We came to the cliffs of Taal to get the hang gliding scenes that we needed.
Looks like man has finally learned to fly like a bird. The most amazing thing about this sport to me is that Leonardo da Vinci designed hang gliders before he painted the Mona Lisa. It took us until the 1970s before anybody ever built one. If da Vinci had built one according to his plans, Man might have flown this way hundreds of years before he did.
Soon he will be free. Soon the boy is sailor. Soon the sea will rock him.
They'll fly down and land on the lake beach below. Sometimes if they get enough wind, they can actually gain enough altitude to land on the spot that they had just taken off from.
And when she calls me,
On another nearby lake called Kalaraya, we got some of the water skiing footage that we needed.
he will bring me back to you.
Lake Kalaraya is a water skier's paradise. Not only is the water as smooth as glass here, it's about 75 degrees. So when you fall in, it feels as though you're falling into a bathtub.
Soon the sea will hold. Soon he will be free. Soon
The two sports of surfing and water skiing are really very similar in many ways. Actually, a surfboard is shaped like a big water ski. They both have little fins on the back to provide stability, and you control them in a similar way by the way you move your body and shift your weight.
The water was so smooth at Lake Kalaraya, one Filipino guy here didn't even need a ski. His bare feet were enough. He would get up on two skis, kick one off, then the other, and he would be skiing barefoot. Well, without another typhoon to provide us with the waves we needed, we had to ride the only waves we could find, which turned out to be the wake to the boat. I guess that's about the smallest wave you can surf on. When the rope goes slack like that, it means I'm riding the little wave rather than being pulled by the boat. The secret to surfing is gravity. You see, every wave is like a hill that keeps building up in front of you. As long as you're sliding down the front part of that hill, you're surfing. If you want to go faster, you move toward the front of the board. If you want to slow down, you step back. If you get too far up toward the front of the board, you do something that back in the 60s we used to call purling. That's purling. A couple of times while doing this, I noticed that the water was only about a foot deep below the board. If you should happen to fall in very shallow water, you want to try and land flat so you skip like a stone and not hit the bottom. Like this. Well, we didn't spend much time that next couple of weeks in our penthouse in Manila. We spent most of our time exploring the west coast of Luzon by Bangka. We're heading for an area called 100 Islands, north of Manila, in that sheltered cove there. On our arrival, it wasn't hard to see how 100 Islands had gotten its name. There really were about 100 little closely knit islands here.
100 Islands has definitely not been overly developed. This was our hotel during our stay here.
At 100 Islands, we met a very interesting guy named Juni Binamera. Here he is. Juni Binamera is a scuba diver. He had just finished a dive and he was cleaning the shells that he had found when we met him. He told us that these shells were just laying all over the bottom here. This is not a country that's been picked over yet by divers. Well, it was a good thing we ran into Juni because my partner Clark was not a scuba diver. Part of our job was to film underwater. First, we rented a banca to go out exploring the 100 Islands. Interesting little islands. Many of them look like giant mushrooms growing up out of the sea due to the erosion of the salt water. This is also the only place in the world that I've ever seen where you can get an island all to yourself. These boatmen will agree to drop you alone or you and a friend off on an island, and they won't bring anybody else to your island for as long as you want to stay. You can camp here or explore all the old wrecks from the days of piracy. Just play Robinson Crusoe for a while. Well, since Clark was not a scuba diver, this idea appealed to him. We dropped him off on an island of his own for a couple of days, while Juni and I went off in search of the underwater world. I found that in the Philippines you could walk up to a fisherman, almost any fisherman, and for about the amount of money he would have made fishing that day, he'd much rather spend the day exploring with us. That meant for between $5 and $10 I could get a guide and a boat all day long. A guide who made his living from the sea and could show us right where to find the most beautiful underwater scenery. I was very happy that they had asked us to film underwater in this country. The underwater world in the Philippines speaks for itself. Follow me here and I'll show you around. The main difference between diving in the warm or the cold waters of the world is that in the warm waters we have coral. This is a coral reef, like a living underwater mountain.
Isilang ka sa mundong ito, laking tuwa ng magulang mo, at ang kamay nila ang iyong ilaw.
And the fish that you find on the coral reefs of the world are the most colorful anywhere.
At ang nanay at tatay mo'y di malaman ang gagawin.
Most coral reefs are like giant underwater plateaus with a flat surface about 30 to 40 feet deep and then a drop-off that goes down for possibly hundreds of feet where those fish are swimming. We're sort of swimming along the edge of that undersea tabletop, exploring its surface.
Sa umaga na may kalong ka ng iyong amang tuwang-tuwa sa'yo.
When I first saw this, I thought it was a piece of coral, which is usually very rigid and sharp. But this turned out to be an elephant ear sponge. It felt like thick rubber. Another sponge, a barrel sponge, so big that I could get down inside of it. This is coral. The bubbles can usually pass right through coral because it's very porous. From underneath it looks like this. Here's a variety of soft coral called leather coral. You don't want to touch this guy. He's a scorpion fish, closely related to a stonefish, which is more venomous than a cobra. They won't attack you, but as you can see, they blend into your scenery. If you step on them, the stingers in their back go into your foot. Junie's found some clownfish here. Clownfish have a fascinating symbiotic relationship with a sea anemone. Now that anemone, which looks like a big flower, can sting. But the little clownfish coat their bodies with a mucus from the anemone, which makes them immune to the stings. This gives them a safe place to live. In return for this favor, they attract food to their anemone. These two creatures need each other. There are many symbiotic relationships in the sea. One problem that they do have in this country is dynamite fishing. It's not illegal here for the fishermen to throw charges of dynamite overboard to kill the fish. Unfortunately, it also kills the reef. As we can see here in this blasted out area, it's not really an ecological problem for the fish. They grow back very quickly. But a coral reef is like a forest. It could take hundreds, sometimes thousands of years to grow, and large parts of it can be killed in a matter of moments by the blasting. By diving deeper here, we get out of the blasted area. The deeper in the ocean you go, the darker it gets. That's a lobster trap in the background there. Junie's blowing bubble rings here. You do this the same way that you blow smoke rings. Takes a little bit more practice though. We're down well below 100 feet now. Down where the red coral fans grow. There's danger down at this depth. Danger of something called nitrogen narcosis. Too much nitrogen in your blood gives you a feeling of being drunk. The real danger is that you'll do something crazy like offer your mouthpiece to a fish. That's been done. That's why it's wise to never dive alone. It's rare for this to afflict two people at the same time. If you get into trouble, your partner can usually help you out. Once you swim to a shallower depth, the feeling goes away.
I figured that Clark was about ready to leave that private little island of his own by now. But first we found this fresh mountain waterfall here. Cool, fresh water felt good after 75-degree salt water all day.
I was right about Clark. He was ready to leave his island. He had a very good time, though. He said someday he wanted to return, spend more time, and do some writing here. On our way back to Luzon that evening, we both agreed that 100 Islands was the most colorful part of the Philippines that we had seen so far.
At ang una mong nilapitan ang iyong inang lumuluha. At ang tanong, anak, ba't ka nagkaganyan?
We're going to take a bit of a break from our water sports project, long enough to go up into the mountains, visit the mountain province, land of the headhunters. The only modern city in the mountain province is the city of Baguio. And when you enter this city, you realize that Baguio was designed by the hand of an artist. If you only have a few days to spend in the Philippines, you do have time to see Baguio. It's about a half a day's trip from Manila, up a comfortable highway in a modern bus. Once you arrive here, you find beautiful hotels, restaurants, whatever you could possibly want. But once you get past Baguio, the going in the mountains gets pretty rugged. We're past Baguio now on a mountain bus. These little mountain buses have no aisle down the middle, so the conductor has to climb along the outside to collect the fare from you, while he holds on and hangs out over these cliffs. I could never understand why they didn't collect the fare before the trip, but they don't. We would frequently be in very primitive territory, then we'd turn a corner and see a brand new hotel or something else very modern. I found that in the last 10 years, this country has come further toward joining the modern world than it had in hundreds of its earlier years. We spent the night in the Mount Dada Lodge, a beautiful hotel in the higher parts of the mountain. We woke up the next morning to a breakfast that we ate with an Australian family also staying there. We got to talking to them and missed our bus that was going up to Bontoc and Banaue. But our hotel owner said no problem. He arranged for a hotel jeep to take us up to a logging camp where the bus always stopped for a while. Another example of that hospitality. Clark and I were always getting into one jam or another by making dumb mistakes, like missing our bus.
But whenever we did this, the Filipinos would make it impossible for us to get stranded. They would always offer us a ride or a place to stay, whatever we needed. We never had to ask.
The buses were waiting at the logging camp when we arrived. These mountain buses are very sturdy. They have to be. They're the only link that many of the mountain tribes have with the outside world. So whatever comes and goes from these mountains has to do it by bus. That's the pigs and the chickens underneath your seat, the half a ton of house building material tied to the roof, and you. You all go bouncing up these dirt roads together, and you always seem to be looking straight down. The Bontoc people in these mountains tattoo their bodies when they're very young. The ancient Ifugaos in Banaue dug the rice terraces, something we'll see in a moment. And the ancient Igorots used to mummify their dead and bury them in the many burial caves in Kabayan. These mountain people were the most interesting and colorful Filipinos that we had seen so far. All the mountain people have one habit in common. They all chew betel nut. It's a fairly powerful stimulant. They grind it together with other herbs and chew it all day long, young and old alike. Tastes terrible. These are the rice terraces of Banaue. The ancient Ifugaos dug them close to 2,000 years ago. It's a way to grow rice, a crop that requires flat land on the side of a mountain. They would build their village in the center, and then generation after generation would terrace more and more of the surrounding mountains until the village was all but lost, surrounded by many miles of these beautiful terraces. Life has really changed very little up here in the past few hundred years. The ancient Ifugaos' lifestyle is so well suited to their surroundings that nothing has had to change. They build their huts up on stilts to keep the crawling things out. And they build them very strong. Down in the lowlands, the nipa huts blow down every time there's a big typhoon. But these Ifugao huts endure 10, sometimes 15 years without having to be rebuilt. Mountain people always seem to stick to their ancient way more than most people. It makes them fascinating, so I always make it a point to search out the mountain tribes. This is our new guide, Johnny, and his little boy. Our other guide, Leo, went back to Manila for a while. He didn't speak the languages up here. There's about 85 different languages and dialects in the Philippines. Sometimes in these mountains you can walk over a hill to a different tribe where a different language is being spoken.
When we first entered this village, Johnny immediately sat down with the elders and started passing out the betel nut and talking. In no time at all, he had not only convinced them to give us a place to stay for the night, but also to slaughter a couple of chickens for our evening meal. They're making rice wine here.
As I mentioned, there is quite a history of headhunting up here. They say that it doesn't happen anymore, but if this old guy could speak English, he'd probably have a few stories to tell. There is one tribe of people up here called the Ilongots, and they say that if an Ilongot man wishes to marry an Ilongot woman, he has to first present her father with at least one Christian head. And this can only be done during the 2 months of the year when the fire tree is in bloom. That's the only time of year that an Ilongot can get married. They also say that they're not too choosy about the Christian part of it. If you're not another Ilongot, you're Christian enough. We're heading for another part of the mountain province, Kabayan, where the flowers bloom and where the ancient ones used to mummify their dead and put the mummies in the many burial caves here. I said that I would like to see these Filipino mummies. They told me I would have to take a walk through the mountains for a day or so and cross a couple of scary bridges. I said no problem until I got to the first bridge. They told me that I wouldn't have any problem as long as I didn't step in the holes.
Feeling some moving me and falling down and down. Some believers moving me and calling me now.
Oh, some of the things that I do for you people. Well, there were many little caves high in the rocks and larger ones down below, and they were all completely filled with coffins. The ancient ones put the coffins up there, and the people today maintain these wooden foundations, such as they are, to keep the coffins up there. They asked me if I'd like to see the inside of one. Before I could even answer, they pulled one out and popped it open for me. A Kabayan mummy. This is an adult. That's the position that he was buried in. They say that the mummification process was fascinating. The elders in the tribe would blow smoke through a bamboo pole into the mouths of the dead ones for a long time after the death had occurred until they were dry. Then they would carve a container according to the type of life that the person had lived and put them in a cave. In one cave we found hundreds of skulls. Nobody knew how they got there because the ancient Ifigaos didn't write down their history. They figured that it must have been a tribal war or a very successful headhunting campaign. Well, Johnny woke me up early one morning and said that we had to go to the Kanyao festival. I had learned by now to listen to him when he said things like this, so we got up, walked for most of the morning, and around noon we came over the crest of a hill down into a beautiful little village where a fascinating festival was underway, an Ifugao Kanyao. Many of these Ifugaos have walked through the mountains for days to get here and to participate in this festival. There's been a bad rice crop this year, so the mountain people feel that the spirits of the mountain have something against them. They feel that if they dance for 3 days and 3 nights and then slaughter 3 pigs and everybody feasts, the spirits will realize that they're really good people and deserve a better break from nature. Christianity has found its way up here, but the mountain people still hold to their old ways. I didn't attract much attention when I started filming, until the wrong guy saw me. He saw me. After a moment, he yelled out a couple of words in Ifugao, and the music stopped. As I was beginning to notice all these human bones around here, like this jawbone, the old guy picked up a spear, walked over, and started yelling at me in Ifugao. I said, "I'm sorry I've offended you. I'll stop filming. I'll do anything you want. Just put down the spear." Well, he didn't understand a word I said, but Johnny did. Came over and talked to him for a few minutes. Then he told me that I could film, but first I had to give them 7 pesos to buy gin to mix with the rice wine. Well, 7 pesos was less than $1, so I gave it to them. A runner went off to get the gin, And now I was not only allowed to film, but I was also required to participate in the whole thing. Had to dance and drink the rice wine. First somebody gave me half a coconut shell. Then they filled it with rice wine. Every time I drank it, somebody would refill it. The guy who would refill it had a container of black feathers on his back. I found out that it was his sacred chore to keep everybody's coconut shell filled for 3 days. There he is, back by the hut, working hard. Rice wine has a lot of pulp in it, so you sort of chew it while you drink it. And I couldn't find out why anybody needed gin to mix with that rice wine. Well, a history of headhunting maybe, but there's no denying the beauty of their lives. These people live up in the mountains, which is the most colorful part of the Philippines we saw. These flowers are wild. They're not part of any garden, but they're growing everywhere. The very colorful lifestyle of the mountain people really just reflects the beauty all around them.
Too many heartaches, so many tears, too many lonely years. Please let me share this mountain moon with you. Cold last starry night, so much in love. Please let me lie till the cold I'll bring the dove. The cold I've seen love, the cold I've seen war. I'm lying on the cold out mountain with you. The real Hawaiian peace come through. She knew the reverie song with the wind. Listen, you can hear crying to the sea.
We're on a train now heading down out of the mountains, past Manila to the southern part of the island of Luzon, to a city called Legazpi.
Please let me share this mountain.
When we came down out of the mountains, the temperature and the humidity went back up into the 90s. I realized that we were still in the tropics. The air in the mountains was a bit cooler, sort of like California. At one point, I noticed that there were bamboo poles stretched from treetop to treetop. I asked the guy sitting next to me why, and he told me that in order to make coconut wine called tuba, you have to tap the coconut while it's still growing on the tree. You can't take it down. So to avoid climbing every tree one at a time, they built this treetop catwalk. This animal's called a carabao. He's the backbone of farm life here.
Please let me lie in the morning light with you.
And this is Legazpi City in the shadow of Mayon volcano.
So much in love.
Mount Mayon is supposed to be the most perfectly shaped volcano in the world.
I can see the dove.
Legazpi's an interesting little place too. There's always a cool sea breeze here to keep the temperature down. Many of the women in Legazpi smoke big black cigars.
And the carabao here get treated better than any other farm animal that I've ever seen. They're really very gentle animals. A child can go to sleep on a carabao's back, and the animal will actually make an effort to not drop him off there while he sleeps. But only in Legazpi did the carabao wear rubber shoes to protect their tender feet from these tough dirt roads. Most of the people were barefoot, but the carabao were wearing rubber shoes. Many things in the Philippines seem to be the way Hawaii must have looked 100 years ago.
Real Hawaiian peace come through. She knew the reverie song with the wind. Listen, you can hear crying to the sea. Song of peace.
Mount Mayon is a sleeping giant right now, but she's definitely not a dead one. Every 10 years or so, this mountain erupts and they have to evacuate Legazpi City. Back around the turn of the century, one eruption buried this church in hot lava. Many were hiding inside at the time. They were all killed. They left the tower and the wall standing as a monument to Mayon. We're on a Philippine Airlines plane now, heading south.
For the first time in this movie, we're going to leave the large island of Luzon and visit some of the southern islands. The Philippines consists of Luzon, the large island in the north, Mindanao, the other large island in the south, and the smaller islands in between called the Visayan Islands, or just the Visayas. Clark and I decided to split up here to cover our water sports project more thoroughly. He went down to Cebu to see about some windsurfing he'd heard of there. I went down to Leyte and Samar. I figured on the Pacific coast I might find some good surf. Philippines sky at night. If you take a flight anywhere in this country at around sunset time, you will always see a sight like this. Guaranteed. Well, I didn't find any surf when I arrived, but I did find a very interesting bit of World War II history. Back during the war, on a tiny island called Corregidor, in the mouth of Manila Bay, General MacArthur, General Wainwright, President Quezon of the Philippines, and a handful of American and Filipino soldiers were holding out. You see, the Japanese knew that in order to take this country, first they had to take the capital city. Well, to get to Manila, they had to get past Corregidor, so we fortified this little rock with everything we had. But at that time during the war, the Japanese had quite a bit more. President Roosevelt realized this. He didn't want to lose his top general, so he ordered MacArthur to leave. MacArthur did slip out one night on a PT boat bound for a submarine, bound for Australia. But before he left, he promised the Filipinos that he would return. These are Japanese graves. Well, with General Wainwright in charge, Corregidor then sustained a more brutal shelling than any other place in the world, with an exception of Dresden in Germany. This building was their command headquarters more than a mile long. This is all that was left of it after that shelling. Finally, General Wainwright had to surrender the Philippines to the Japanese. They held this country for more than 3 years. The survivors at Corregidor were forced to undergo the Bataan Death March. They were marched all the way to Manila. More than a third of them died. The ones who survived were imprisoned in the walled city, Fort Santiago, a 300-year-old Spanish fort, which still stands in Manila today. The Japanese used it as their headquarters during the occupation. They put in some modern armaments and used the dungeons below as a prison for the POWs. Well, they've started to dig out the old walled city now. You can walk around in these ruins and feel the ghosts, not only from the Second World War, but also from Spanish time, more than 300 years ago. I met one Filipino man who had been a tent boy during the Japanese occupation. He had served the Japanese, and he told me that they didn't really plan on spending too much time with Hawaii. The Japanese wanted to conquer Hawaii and get directly on to Hollywood so they could capture all the movie stars. They had all seen American movies. This old fort was so formidable that it took weeks longer to dig the Japanese out of here after they had lost the rest of the country. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before all this could take place, MacArthur had to keep his promise and return. He returned and landed on the island of Leyte, where I had just landed. There's a statue on the beach where MacArthur and his men first marched up on shore. But before that could happen, the largest naval battle in history had to take place in the Leyte Gulf. When the Japanese retreated inland, MacArthur and his men marched up on shore, and MacArthur set up his command headquarters in this large mansion in Tacloban City. One old Filipino guy told me that he used to see the general marching up and down this porch, smoking his corncob pipe, and planning how to retake the Philippines with his officers. Well, for the next 6 weeks, there was a battle from one end of Leyte to the other. It was sort of like Corregidor in reverse. Now, the Japanese realized that if they lost this one island, in essence, the rest would fall like dominoes, and that's what happened. Finally, the Japanese surrendered at a far end of the island at a place called Buka Buka Hill. And soon, for the first time in more than 300 years, the Filipinos governed themselves. Now, why this war story, you might wonder, in the middle of this water sports adventure? Well, I happened to arrive here at exactly the time of the 33rd Leyte reunion. 33 years earlier to the day, all of that fighting had taken place here. And now the Philippine government had invited all the veterans to return in a reunion for peace. This is Gay Felice. He was MacArthur's personal photographer during the war. He followed the general everywhere and took most of those photographs that we see of MacArthur today. He told me that, with an exception of all the destruction, everything else looked very much the same.
And now these guys were returning with their wives and revisiting the beaches that they had fought on so many years earlier. Well, even though these beaches hadn't changed, about 5 miles away there was an engineering masterpiece. It's part of a master plan to eventually connect the northern and southern Philippines with one highway, from north to south. The closer islands will be spanned by these large island bridges. It's just another example of modern technology coexisting with this colorful old Philippine lifestyle. Well, early the next morning, something very interesting happened. I was awakened with the dawn, and before I knew it, I was hustled into a jeepney and I was being driven down a road with Boy Scouts waving flags at me. I asked the woman in charge what was going on, and she said, "Mr. Howard, we have a problem. There's been a miscommunication in Manila. Last night, it took all the veterans to Corregidor. The problem is the people of Leyte had planned 3 days of festivities in their honor. And now, as far as they knew it, I was the only American around." I asked her what she wanted me to do, and she asked me if I would mind representing my country for 3 days in the villages all over Leyte. I said I wasn't even born yet in World War II. She said, "Well, that's all right. The only Japanese guy we could find is even younger than you." I asked her what she wanted me to do, and she said, review parades, make speeches, eat big feasts, just be treated like a king for about 3 days. I said, "Okay, I'll try that." This is the kind of feast that they would lay out for the veterans that they expected. Before eating, I would always have to make a speech, and I would be introduced as Mr. Rick Howard, the American representative for the heroes of the Allied Command in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Try to live up to that.
They had carabao races, bonka races, some of the most interesting games I'd ever seen. I think the most interesting thing, though, is this Japanese guy and I back here, very friendly now. A few years ago, we'd have been in the same place trying to kill each other, carrying on a full-scale war in the country whose people were now honoring us.
There were plenty of Filipino veterans on hand. It's too bad there weren't more American vets here. A lot of these guys were looking for old buddies. We're headed now to the island of Panay, to the city of Kalibo, and to the biggest festival that the Philippines has, the Ati-Ati-Han. When I first entered Kalibo, I expected to find a festival. Instead, there was just this mass cookout of lechon everywhere. I found out that Ati-Ati-Han really begins tomorrow. One thing that Ati-Ati-Han means is big feast that has to last for 3 days. Well, it would not do to run out of lechon on the last day of Ati-Ati-Han, so I think every pig on the island lost his life today. Early the next morning, there was a loud drumbeat in the street. I looked out the window and saw this going by. The Ati-Ati-Han had begun. The Ati-Ati-Han is really the Philippine form of Mardigras. For 3 days and 3 nights, they dance in the streets, wear some of the most interesting costumes that I had ever seen. That drumbeat goes on non-stop, day and night. It has a very hypnotic effect on people. First it gets into your head, then it gets into your feet, like this guy. And pretty soon, you've joined the Ati-Ati-Han. Somebody will rub black soot all over your face. You've become part of the festival. A couple of my Filipino friends told me that these festivals were really sort of a release valve for many of them. You see, the Philippines is really a very conservative country due to their strict Spanish heritage. Anything like dancing or drinking in the streets would be totally unacceptable here, except during a festival. So they have a lot of festivals. This gives all of those people that you might find working in the office buildings of Manila 5 days a week a chance to come down south for the weekend and maybe let their hair down a little bit, overcome a couple of inhibitions. course, some people are always going to be better at overcoming inhibitions than others, and some people are experts at it. This is a man, incidentally, and that's a bell on his head. He rang that thing in his ears for 3 days. I watched him. Maybe that's how he got that way. The thing that's nice about being in costume in a small town like Kalibo is that none of your neighbors know who you are, so you can do whatever you like. This is the mayor and the police chief of Kalibo. The last day of Ati-Ati-Han is always on a Sunday, and on that day the whole city is just one big movement of color. Time to rejoin Clark on Cebu now to see how he's doing and to visit the Dowest temple there. When the Chinese were spreading out through this part of the world, fleeing the hordes of Kublai Khan, everywhere they went they built these beautiful temples. Chinese temples will always have a lot of red and a lot of dragons. The color red is lucky, and dragons keep away the evil ones. This is my favorite Filipino song.
Ang buhay sa mundo, nakangiti kahit hindi totoo. Magandang bulaklak ang siyang katulad mo, ngunit paglapit ko'y walang bango. Balat kayo palang pag-ibig mo, nanatubog lang sa ginto, o kay sakit naman, nasayang lang ang pag-ibig ko. Balat kayo lahat, ang buhay sa mundo, nakangiti ka.
Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan arrived in the Philippines on his way around the world. When he landed on the beach here, he met a chieftain named Lapu-Lapu. These two leaders got along very well for a while until a few problems arose, which caused the Spaniards to end up running for their lives one morning. They only made it as far as the ankle-deep water here, where the Filipino warriors caught up with them.
A bloody battle ensued that lasted for most of the day. Enough Spaniards made it back to the ships to sail the fleet back to Spain, but Magellan wasn't one of them. They say that this is where he died. Story has it that Lapu-Lapu personally cut off his head and proudly displayed it for days. Well, even though the Filipinos got Magellan, Spain ended up getting the Philippines. He had succeeded in bringing the eyes of that powerful nation to these islands. Within the next 50 years, Spain had conquered and colonized most of them. Now their heritage can be seen everywhere. Some of the finest Spanish guitars in the world are made right here. The story I told you about the death of Magellan, that's the official historical version. A few people here had a different story. They said that actually Magellan fell in love with a beautiful Filipina. He didn't want to go back to Spain, which left a problem for his crew. They were afraid that if they went back home without the captain, they might be accused of mutiny. So when they got out to sea, they made up a story that the Filipinos had killed the captain. Spaniards did come back 40 years later looking for Magellan. They couldn't find a grave or any trace of him, so it's really hard to tell which story is the truth. I preferred theirs. Many of these little Visayan islands are so close together, a ferry boat's all that's necessary to make the crossing. It's a very inexpensive, casual way to travel. Very casual. It's also a way to see some of the more out-of-the-way places that you otherwise might miss. For example, on a little island called Bohol, just off of Cebu, I found the most unique natural phenomena that I saw in this country. They're called the Chocolate Hills, and it was easy to see how they got their name. They look like giant pieces of chocolate candy sitting in the forest.
The only hotel in the area is built on top of the largest chocolate hill. That's where I'm shooting this scene from.
I figured they must be volcanic since they were natural, but then I met a guy who had a much better explanation of their origin. He was the gardener for the hotel here.
And he told me that a long time ago there had been a giant who had lived in this area. But he was a very sad giant because he was alone. Then one morning he was walking through the forest and he found a beautiful maiden sitting by a river and singing. Fortunately, she was also a giant, so he introduced himself. In no time at all, he had convinced her to become his bride. Very happy giant now, never going to be alone again.
9 years later, he was even happier because he was going to be a father. It takes giants 9 years instead of just 9 months. Well, as tragedy would have it, his wife and child both died in childbirth. He was devastated. He buried them both under a nearby mountain and walked away crying giant tears. When his tears hit the ground, they became the Chocolate Hills. Well, so far in this film, we've traveled by plane, train, boat, jeepney, banca, bus, tricycle. Time to take a sea cruise on a brand new cruise ship, the Manila City. We're going south again, all the way this time, to the island of Mindanao. We're going to the city of Zamboanga, on the tip of the Zamboanga Peninsula. Clark and I had a very comfortable cabin on board this ship because of our job with the Department of Tourism, but we didn't spend too much time there. It was much more interesting out on deck with the people. All over Asia, you can rent deck space on these ships very inexpensively. You can get a cot or a hammock out on deck. We're below the typhoon belt here, so there was no problem with the weather. It was sort of like camping out for a few days. It can be dangerous, though, because they often overload these ships, causing them to capsize in rough weather. Here's the captain. He's very proud of his brand new ship. I think about the nicest possible way in the world for one person to travel from one place to another is on board a ship, a sea cruise. You always make new friends, romances spring up. Everybody's very excited tonight. For early tomorrow morning, we're going to be sailing into Zamboanga, the home of the Muslims and the land of the mosques. These are the Bajaus. They're the sea gypsies here, and they call their sails vintas. They sail out to meet the incoming ships, to welcome everybody to Zamboanga. The Muslims of Mindanao were the most interesting and colorful Filipinos that we had seen since the mountain people of northern Luzon. They arrived here about 600 years ago. They brought with them a very colorful, also a very warlike lifestyle. The Muslims came sailing north from Indonesia, Malaysia, and Borneo on these large sailing ships. Most of them settled in Mindanao because it was so far south, closer to their homeland. Then about 300 years ago, a man named Ferdinand Legazpi brought Christianity here from Spain. Now these are the two religions of this country. I wouldn't be telling the whole story of Mindanao, though, without mentioning the fact that there is a bit of a civil war going on down here between a group of Muslims called the Moros and the Philippine government. The Moros have been here for more than 600 years. They feel that gives them prior claim to the land. The government disagrees. This is the Monument of Unity, but I'm afraid more often than that, you see things like tanks in the streets, automatic weapons everywhere. I can say that most of the Muslims here are not Moros, though. Most of them are farmers, fishermen, people who want to be left alone to try to raise their children and enjoy life like everybody else in the world wants to do. Sometimes that's very difficult in Southeast Asia. I asked this Muslim fisherman if he would take me out and show me the largest outrigger boats that I had ever seen in my life. Muslim fishing boats getting ready to go out now on a 3-day fishing trip.
Possibly they look very much like the ships that brought their ancestors here more than 6 centuries ago.
You know, people are really the same everywhere. Notice here how the biggest guy is the captain and the littlest guy is the motor?
We're so far south and closer to the equator that the flowers we found in Zamboanga were much more tropical than the ones we saw in the mountains of northern Luzon. I can't really say that they're any prettier. How do you compare one flower to another?
But I can say that Zamboanga had the most beautiful orchids I've ever seen. They have a contest every year to see who can grow the nicest garden. This was the winner the year I was there. There's the man's house. I don't often plug hotels in these films, but sometimes I find a place that I can't resist, like the Zamboanga Plaza. It actually made quite an attempt to provide luxury in a very out-of-the-way place. Inexpensively, too. We're heading for another part of Mindanao, to a city called Davao to see a pearl farm that we had heard of. Notice that we don't travel overland in Mindanao. Much too dangerous.
Have you ever wondered how cultured pearls were made? Well, a natural pearl is made by a grain of sand that gets lodged in an oyster shell. The oyster will build a protective coating around the grain of sand. That turns out to be the pearl. Cultured pearls are made the same way, basically, but instead of a grain of sand, you put a little ball in the oyster that's already pearl-shaped. Then you put the oyster underwater for 2 years, and he builds a real pearl around your little ball.
Now, the thing that's nice about this is that you can make any kind of pearl that you want. That's determined by whatever object you put in the shell. So you can make big pearls, little pearls, double pearls, triple pearls. Somebody here actually put a little crucifix in an oyster shell and made a cross-shaped pearl. Well, I don't want to give the impression that the Philippines is a primitive country. It's not. The people who live in the larger cities live lives as modern as most anybody in the world. But the country does have its primitive tribes, and often they're living very close to the larger cities. For example, just outside of Zamboanga is this Muslim fishing village. Now, Zamboanga itself is no metropolis, but obviously this place hasn't changed in hundreds of years. I didn't attract much attention at first when I started filming until I filmed a young lady walking down the street. There she is. Right after I finished filming her, I found myself eyeball to eyeball with the imam. There he is. He's the spiritual leader, sort of father figure, mayor of the village. But as soon as he found out that all I wanted to do was to take pictures and be friendly, he made sure that I saw everything there was to see in his village. He was very proud of his people and the beautiful work that they do. I found later that I could buy these things very inexpensively by dealing directly with the villagers, rather than the stores in Zamboanga. Transportation was sometimes a problem. Of course, if you lived here, you didn't have any problem at all. Your carabao could get you around as long as you weren't in a hurry. But with our surfboards and cameras, we usually needed some type of vehicle, which the Department of Tourism could almost always provide us with. When they couldn't, there were always the jeepneys.
But we soon found out that in the province it was wiser to take the little tricycles. They didn't cost much more, and they really seemed to overload the jeepneys out here. If we did have to take a bus, we found out that the best place was usually up on the roof with the kids coming home from school. You got a better view from up here, and it wasn't quite so crowded, but you had to hang on. They went pretty fast around some of these jungle roads.
One morning, a friend of ours named Emil invited Clark and I out to his house on the beach for a fish fry. He told us to bring our surfboards along because sometimes he had good waves out there and his neighbors would get a kick out of watching us surf. So we grabbed a couple of tricycles, tied our boards on top, and took off down these windy little roads of Zamboanga for Emil's house. The waves were fairly good that day. While we were out there surfing, Emil was out there with us spearfishing. He was catching more fish than we were waves.
Then he went into the beach and started cooking them over an open fire. When the aroma reached us on the offshore breeze, we decided to make this our last wave, go in and eat lunch before Emil and his kids ate all the fish.
He and his little boy were cooking the last 2 fish for us when we arrived. Emil has a monkey named Chanda. There used to be a saying out here that the monkeys had no tails in Zamboanga because they were bitten off by whales in Zamboanga. We didn't see any whales here, but many of the monkeys like Chanda have lost part of their tail. She did it in an interesting way by lowering her tail down into a crab hole to catch the crab. She figured that the crab would grab on, she'd pull it out, and all of her little monkey friends standing around would grab the crab and eat it. But this time the crab was too big and he got half of Chanda's tail. Well, she had been eating all morning long. Finally, my lunch was ready. I got my banana leaf, my fish, my rice, my whole little lunch set up there, and I got about one bite. Chanda snuck around behind me and grabbed it. I grabbed it back, but she grabbed it again, and she was quicker than me with those little fingers of hers. Before I knew it, my lunch was gone. I got even with it, though. I took her out to catch another one. Look at the grip on the hair here. I found out later she could swim like a fish. She just didn't want to get wet. These are the Bajaus, the sea gypsies. They're the people that sailed out to meet our ship when we arrived. They call them sea gypsies because they build their villages on stilts over the sea. They are very poor people. That's the biggest problem in this country. Malnutrition and the effects of that problem are seen in the people, but not so much among the sea gypsies. Apparently Mother Ocean takes very good care of her sea gypsies. Their teeth are good, they live on giant sea turtles and fish, seaweed. They don't like to spend much time on dry land, though. They only come on land for the few necessities found there. And as soon as they've taken care of business, they get back to the water as quickly as they can, where they feel more secure. They will come on land to sell you beautiful shells or pieces of coral. And even though they're not too crazy about their land, they're usually very anxious for you to come out and visit them in their maze of catwalks and stilts. Very anxious to tell you about their part of the Philippines and to find out where you've come from. As I mentioned, in almost every group, you can find at least one person who can speak English. Well, have you begun to realize that maybe there's a little bit more to this country than perhaps you've heard about recently in the news? It's amazing to me when I think of the fact that I came here with enough money to spend about 2 weeks. I ended up staying 8 months. Getting so lucky in Manila, running into Clark, and following that little element of adventure that led to this whole story. But you know, in this film we've only seen 9 of the larger islands here, when actually there's 7,107 islands in this archipelago. Sort of makes you wonder what's on some of the rest of them, doesn't it? Well, this film is going to end soon, but the adventure doesn't have to end here, for after the Philippines, I went on to Thailand, made a movie called The Real World of Thailand. So until we return to this part of the world one more time, there is one thing I wanted to mention. There's a word that you hear a lot when you step off the plane here. You hear it during the whole time you stay. We need a word like that in our language. The word I'm speaking of means live a long and happy life. This word is mabuhay. So mabuhay, everybody. I'll see you next time.
Ay alay